Good evening.
Good evening.
Once again, I just said this, but we won't meet next week, so please don't forget that. If you show up and there's no one here, you're going to be really confused. All right. We're in Luke chapter 4. We have a ton of stuff to go over, so we're going to get started. Luke chapter 4, the first 13 verses. Starting verse 1. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and at the end of them he was hungry. So the devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone." The devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, "I will give you all their authority and splendor. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours." Jesus answered, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." The devil led him to Jerusalem and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down from here. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you carefully. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered, "It is said, do not put the Lord your God to the test." When the devil had finished all this tempting, he left him until an opportune time. All right, now, I ordinarily would not probably have this much fill-in-the-blank stuff to do or stuff to say just about one section, especially when I'm trying to cover like a whole chapter one night. But sometimes I'm a little self-indulgent and I like to geek out about stuff, okay? You probably have already realized that by now, even though we're only like 6 weeks in. I had a class in college that was all just the book of Luke. It was like 15 weeks, just over the book of Luke. And my final paper for that class was over the temptation of Christ in Luke. And so I can really nerd out on that kind of stuff. Don't worry, we haven't actually, we've just read our verses, but we haven't actually really said anything of substance yet. So
It'll be okay.
you're not even late in my eyes.
Well, I'm not late, and I had time catching on to that stuff last week, so I might still be lost.
We're all kind of lost.
I guess we're not used to the dates.
But anyway, there is a lot here to cover, but part of that is just me being a little self-indulgent and going overboard. But all right, 3 questions. All right, question number 1: how are the 2 aspects of Jesus's person attacked? All right, well, here's your first blank. Jesus's humanity is targeted most in the first temptation. All right, if you are the Son of God, turn this rock into bread. All right, and for B, you don't have anything to fill in, but Satan is targeting a very real human desire for food. Part of being the Son of God in the flesh includes hungering, right? I mean, Jesus was fully God and fully human, so he experienced hunger like the rest of us. But Jesus cannot use his status as the Son of God to overcome his hunger, for to do so would be for Jesus to lose his human nature. Or maybe misuse would maybe be a better word. But anyway. C, this is a fill in the blank. Jesus' divinity is targeted most in the last temptation. All right. Just write the word divine, drop the E, I-T-Y. D-I-V-I-N-I-T-Y. So you have the 2 aspects of Jesus, right? Fully man, his humanity is targeted in the first temptation. The last temptation, fully God, his divinity is targeted when it says, right, bow down and worship me and I'll give you all of this. All right. The last temptation is throw yourself off of this ledge and have your angels catch you. That's the one that I'm talking about. Okay, so Satan's quotation of Scripture, Psalm 91. All right, this is that last temptation I was just talking about. So verse 10, Satan says, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you carefully. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. All right. This comes from Psalm 91. And in Satan's way of thinking, a divine being cannot, or at the very least should not, suffer. Luke, however, really Jesus, but Luke seems to disagree, all right? Because in Luke's gospel, we see repeatedly that Jesus was specifically born in order to suffer, all right? And I'm not going to necessarily go and pull these up and read them, but Luke 9:22, Luke 9:44, and Luke 9:58, it's all talking about the Son of Man must suffer many things, and this is also the same chapter where Jesus says, foxes have holes and birds have nests, but I don't have anywhere to lay my head. So to be the Son of God is actually to suffer, all right? Satan had that wrong. He kind of twisted that, all right? Letter E, Jesus demonstrated true divinity by not pitting his own divine self against the will of God the Father, all right? Letter F, the middle temptation. This is interesting. So you have the first temptation, targets his humanity. You're hungry because you're fully human. Turn the stone into bread, all right? Jesus says, I'm not going to do that. Last temptation targets his divinity, right? If you're the Son of God, throw yourself off of this ledge and his angels will catch you, all right? The middle temptation challenges both his humanity and his divinity, all right? Because this is your fill in the blank thing. Having control over the nations is something that only a supernatural being can accomplish, or only a divine being can accomplish, all right? So something only a supernatural being can accomplish, but avoiding suffering is something that humans desire, right? So, obviously I can't have control over all the nations, all right? Even if I had some sort of physical control over all the nations, no one's really ever ruled the world. But assuming that I could, right, and I really did take over the whole world, that wouldn't really mean anything on a spiritual level, all right? So having control of the nation is something only really a supernatural being can do. But the temptation was, hey, you can have all of that, but avoid the cross. You can avoid the suffering. You can avoid the homelessness, right? And that is really targeting that, human desire for power and glory apart from suffering. All right. Question 2, is there any truth to what the devil's saying, or does the devil actually have any leverage against Jesus? In other words, is the devil bluffing, or, does he actually have an ace up his sleeve, so to speak? All right. Letter A on this one. There is additional dialogue that's given to Satan in Luke's account that we don't have in Matthew's account, all right? Satan says, all this authority I will give you and their glory, for this has been delivered to me, and I give it to whomever I wish. Right? How true is that? Is that true? Is that not true? Let's talk about that. All right. Here, Satan strikes once again at Jesus' human and divine natures by offering him the kingdoms of the world in exchange for worship. All right. Now we know already from chapter 1 that Jesus will already be given a kingdom with no end. All right. This was prophesied during the foretelling of Jesus' birth in chapter 1, Luke 1:33. So the Father will give Jesus authority over the world once his earthly mission is complete. That's your blank, all right? Once Jesus' earthly mission is complete, once he has lived, once he has died, once he has risen again, and his earthly mission is complete, then Jesus will gain authority over the entire world in that spiritual sense like we talked about, all right? However, this is a quote from Joel B. Green, all right? I think at some point the Joel part got chopped out. It just says Green. But anyway, it's a quote from a guy. It says, the devil proposes to displace God as Jesus' benefactor. In other words, instead of getting that authority from God the Father, the devil says, hey, let's make a deal, all right? I'll give you authority over the whole world. You don't even have to go to the cross. You don't even have to suffer. You don't have to do any of that. And in exchange, all I want is your worship, all right? That's basically what's going on here, all right? Letter C, the difference being that Jesus can avoid, that's your blank, that Jesus can avoid his purpose of incarnating or being born to suffer on behalf of the world through worshiping Satan, all right? If Jesus were to take Satan's offer, the difference between, I carry out my mission and I get authority after my mission is complete, or I bow down and worship God right now and I get the authority, all right? The difference is that Jesus can avoid his purpose of being born to suffer on behalf of the world, all right? So if Jesus worshipped before Satan, if Jesus worshipped Satan, he would be a lesser ruler with delegated authority serving a higher ruler, all right? And then this is from an author named Susan Garrett, professor at one of those Ivy League schools that's really impressive, like Harvard or something. I don't know. Anyway, doesn't matter. So he says, much like the beast of the earth that serves the beast of the sea in the book of Revelation, all right, you have basically all of these levels of designated authority where, in one sense, all of it comes from God. So whatever authority that Satan does have comes from God, right? We don't believe that God and Satan are complete equals where Satan can just have authority without God allowing him to. But even under that, you have like some authority of like, okay, well, you have Satan giving some authority to other creatures, and then those creatures giving them to other things. So anyway, that's basically kind of Satan's play here, all right? And again, is it a bluff or is he being serious? Not entirely the point. Basically, Satan's move here in this temptation is, all right, God's given me authority over this world to some extent. I can give you that authority. It might be a lesser authority than if you were to just serve God, carry out your mission, die on the cross, and get authority directly from God. It might be a lesser authority, but it's a lot easier to obtain. All right? Letter D. Satan's rule is clearly limited. I kind of said that. As ruler specifically of the human world, indicated by Luke's use of the term, I just copied and pasted stuff from my paper, so if it sounds really academic, don't worry about it. Fancy Greek word, which basically means the inhabited world or the human population. All right, so in other words, right, we're not saying that Satan has total authority over the souls of mankind or whatever. Like, we're not saying that in a universal, Satan can snap his fingers and the universe falls apart kind of sense. We're not talking about that. We're talking about for the human, the earth, here we are, flesh and blood. Satan has some sort of authority, all right? I mean, ruler of this world kind of thing, so to speak, all right? Letter E. The test is that though Satan's offered authority might be less, it can be achieved in a much simpler or easier way, and at the cost of his perfect humanity and perfect divinity. All right. Now, question 3. How does this play into Jesus' ministry throughout the rest of Luke? All right. Because really, well, hold on. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Sorry. Let me back that up. Letter A, under that. This kind of says what I was going to say. Satan is attempting to undercut the nature of Jesus and his ministry before it even gets started. All right. So what I was going to say is, really, Jesus' ministry hasn't even started yet. It hasn't even begun. And already, if this goes poorly, if this goes bad, we're not going to have a Luke 5 to 24 or whatever, right? Like, the story pretty much ends here. All right. It doesn't, all right, but that's basically right. Satan doesn't wait until, it's Luke chapter 20 and you're about to be crucified, and now I'm going to hammer you with all the temptation, right? No, Satan says, hey, I'm going to cut you off right at the beginning before you even get started, or he's going to try to anyway, all right? Letter B, if Jesus gives in, he will jeopardize his mission, which is revealed at Nazareth, all right? So the very next section we're going to read is Jesus at Nazareth, where he straight up says what his mission is: to bring the good news, to bring healing, to bring liberty, to bring sight to the blind, and ultimately, Jesus says, to proclaim it's the acceptable year of the Lord, all right? If Jesus gives in, he's going to jeopardize all of that. And all this stuff, right? Healing, liberty, sight to the blind, the year of the Lord, all that. It's only possible through Jesus' obedience. And the devil knows this, right? The devil's a smart character, all right? Don't ever think Satan's dumb. Satan's one of the, I'm going to say wise, and people are going to say, well, how wise are you if you betray God? Maybe not wise, but he's crafty. He's clever, all right? He knows what he's doing. He knows how to get you, all right? Satan knows that, all right? So that's, again, how this is sort of shaking out, all right? don't ever just read this and think, okay, well, Jesus is, super high powered, the power of God, and so, there was never any potential threat from the temptation of Satan, all right? Like, Satan knew what he was doing, all right? He crafted this temptation very carefully, all right? Letter C, having resisted an amount of secondhand authority from Satan, Jesus now reigns with total divine authority, all right? So in other words, right, Jesus resisted Satan's temptation. He goes out, he does his ministry, he lives his life, he dies on the cross, he rises again, he ascends back to heaven, and now, right, he reigns with total authority. And we know that one day that's not just going to be that spiritual authority, but one day he really is going to reign here physically on earth as well. And we, even today, are still waiting for that, right? Jesus now reigns with total divine authority, and yet he is able to intercede or to go before the Father for the rest of humanity because he himself is the perfect human, all right? So letter D, it's precisely because Jesus was tempted but did not sin that man can come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Anyone know where that's from? Hebrews 4:16, that's your blank. All right, Hebrews 4:16. So even grace itself is kind of on the line here, so to speak. All right, did anyone miss any blanks or anything before we jump into the next section? I'm trying to go fast because, again, there is a lot to this chapter. Okay, picking up in verse 14 with the Nazareth rejection. All right, Luke 4:14. Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread throughout the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him, and he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they asked. Jesus said to them, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself.' And you will tell me, 'Do here in your hometown what we have heard that you do in Capernaum.' Truly I tell you," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet none of them were cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this, and they got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. Okay, that was a lot, I know. But I broke this down not into questions this time, but just into sections, all right? So, and yours is a little bit different than mine because mine kind of flips back and forth between these. But the silence of God, all right? The biggest question that I want to deal with from these, 15, 16 verses, whatever, is the question, this is letter A. Why didn't Jesus perform a miracle in Nazareth? All right. Yes.
I'm sorry. He did. But it was a private miracle. And the people of Nazareth were not ready for a public miracle.
Yes, I mean, obviously,
When he passed through them unnoticed, that was a miraculous escape from their clutches.
yes.
But that was one that they did not realize that there was a miracle had been performed. But the people were not ready, the people of Nazareth were not ready for a miracle.
Right. I think the question is, why didn't Jesus perform a healing miracle, which is basically what the people are asking for, according to Jesus, right? Surely some of you will quote this proverb, physician, heal yourself. In other words, right, prove it, right? You say this is fulfilled in our hearing today, prove it, right? Snap your fingers, do some healing or something, and prove it, all right? That's really the question that I mean. I mean, obviously, when people are about to like stone you and throw you off a cliff, then if you disappear and walk through their midst, obviously that's a miracle. But why doesn't Jesus play into their games, I guess basically is the question, all right? And I think that in 2025, this might be the most important aspect of this section to focus on, all right? Because people today, they often have this misunderstanding about the Bible. They think that in Bible times, God was just constantly doing miracles and constantly revealing himself, all right? In other words, right, like there wasn't a single day that went by that God wasn't parting seas or, prophets weren't healing people or, like crazy, like suns standing in the sky or whatever, like whatever, all right? The truth is, all right, the Bible is really the highlight reel of God's work in humanity, all right? Sort of, it's like a history book, all right? You're probably not going to read in your history book when, George Washington went on vacation, all right? Because that doesn't really add anything to the overall narrative of the founding of the United States, all right? Same way in the Bible, right? If you're, the writer of Exodus, yeah, you're going to include the parting of the Red Sea, you're going to include the manna from heaven or whatever. You're probably not going to include when, Moses has, his day off and he sits home and watches the Cowboys or whatever, right? Like that's probably not going to make it into the book, all right? So it's not necessarily that God was doing something crazy every single day up until, the end of the book of Acts, and then all of a sudden, hey, that stopped and God didn't do anything at all, all right? Second, I think, God was not performing miracles everywhere, all right? God did occasionally reveal himself to other nations and other people, and I've said this before, and it's true, non-Israelites were always welcome to join in the covenant community and worship God, but God rarely went out of his way to reveal himself to them like he did to Israel, all right? So to get back to that question of why didn't Jesus perform a miracle in Nazareth, all right, and why I think that's sort of the most important aspect to focus on, all right, it's because people apply this misunderstanding of the Bible. I think that's why it's the most important aspect to focus on, right? Well, God's performing this miracle like every single day in every part of the world, and then one day he just stops, all right? And in other words, right, Jesus's refusal to perform a miracle in Nazareth sort of answers the question of the silence of God or divine hiddenness, all right? So letter B, why does God hide himself in the world today, all right? I'm not saying he does. I'm saying this is the way that people think today, all right? Again, misunderstanding of how the Bible works. People ask, why does God hide himself in the world today, and why doesn't he make his existence more known, all right? And there is a little bit of truth in that, right? I mean, I don't want to completely discredit people that don't believe in God and say that, there isn't at least a little bit of truth to the aspect that like, okay, yeah, like, obviously during like the 3 years that Jesus was on earth, people could see Jesus with their own eyes and they could see miracles happening on a somewhat regular basis. Like, I mean, obviously we don't have that today, but there is this misunderstanding of really how that works. Okay, so there is a letter C under the silence of God, Ignore that for right now. We're going to come back to that. Jump to number 2, all right? Jesus' case for a better prophethood, all right? Jesus sort of preemptively responds to people's critique of his ministry, all right? Nobody actually said, physician, heal yourself. That's sort of Jesus saying, hey, I know that you're going to say this. And Jesus' response, much like his responses to Satan during his temptation, refer back to the Old Testament. All right. Jesus points out that during Elijah's ministry, right, he wasn't solely, singularly focused on Israel or the Israelites. Why is that? All right. Well, according to Jesus, it's because no prophet is accepted in his hometown. All right. But what does that mean? Like, what does that mean exactly? All right. And I think the most common understanding is, you link verse 24 where Jesus says a prophet's not accepted in his hometown back to what the crowd says in verse 22. Wasn't this Joseph's son? In other words, right, the crowd couldn't perceive Jesus as anything other than just a hometown boy, all right? He's just a man, right? He's just the son of a carpenter, right? However, as true as that is, I think there's a little bit more to it than that, all right? This aspect of a prophet is not accepted in his hometown, I think there's a little bit more to it than that, all right? Just as part of the main idea of the temptation was Jesus proving his sonship, or right, making a better case for being the Son of God through obedience. I think here, right, part of the main idea of Jesus' rejection in Nazareth is that he's proving a prophetic identity. Sorry, I thought that was one of your blanks, but I guess not. He's proving a prophetic identity through rejection, all right? One commentator writes that the locals want a mere healer and not a prophet, all right? We kind of already got into that, all right? In other words, right, they're not really ready for a prophet who speaks for God. They just want a magic show, all right? So this should be your blank. To be a prophet, or at least to be a true prophet, is to be rejected, all right? To be a true prophet is to be rejected. The prophet Micah dealt with what I like to describe as a rival prophetic gang, all right? The word gang you're not going to find in the Bible. I just like to think of it that way because I'm weird, all right? But basically, you have Micah, and he speaks on behalf of God. He doesn't always tell the people what they want to hear, all right? He tells them, hey, judgment's coming, and y'all are doing this, and that's wrong, you're doing this, and that's wrong, and blah, 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 all right? The rival prophetic gang, so to speak, they just say, everything's fine. You're fine. Everything's great. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to see here, all right? However, Micah proved a couple things. Number one, he proved that they were dishonest, obviously, because everything wasn't fine. Number two, he proved that they were unknowledgeable of God's ways, because God doesn't just always make everything fine, right? Especially not in the face of sin. And number three, he proved that these people's loyalty didn't lie with God. It lied with the people, right? And with money, all right? What separated Micah from his rivals was his concern for justice, his concern for mercy, and the way that he called out sin, all right? In other words, right, I'm calling out the way that you are in sin, in treating people, and instead you should treat people with justice and with mercy, all right? And that separated him from these other group of prophets, all right? His rivals, they only proclaimed, this is a direct quote, they only proclaimed plenty of wine and plenty of beer, all right? That's from Micah chapter 2, verse 11. Or Micah 3 says that they promised people peace if the price was right. In other words, right, hey, if you pay me, I'll say whatever you want, right? If you drop 100 in the offering, yeah, God ain't gonna punish you. Everything's great. There's peace. God loves you, right? If the price was right. So people would rather listen to these prosperity prophets, so to speak, than the sin and judgment prophets, the true prophets like Micah. All right, so once again, to be a true prophet is to be rejected by the people. Jesus is, in other words, drawing upon a very long history of true prophets that were rejected by their own people in order to demonstrate the truthfulness of his own message. All right, a prophet is without honor in his own home. All right, I'm telling you today what I have read, right? the year of the Lord's favor, this has been fulfilled in your sight today. But you're going to reject me, and that actually proves more that what I'm saying is true, all right? I could do a miracle to you, and I could prove that what I'm saying is true, but actually I'm making a better case for what I'm saying by not doing anything and by you rejecting me, because every other true prophet has also been rejected by their own people. And that might seem a little backwards in our way of thinking, but Jesus also wasn't a 21st century American, so it doesn't really matter what our way of thinking is, all right? Jesus knew that the crowd wanted a miracle, they wanted a healing, but they didn't want a true prophet that called out sin, that called out oppression. Obviously, freedom from prisoners, setting the oppressed free, naturally that means freedom from sin and freedom from the curses of sin, all right? So just as Jesus makes, this is letter B. Just as Jesus makes a better case for sonship through his obedience, think back to the temptation narrative, Jesus makes a better case for prophethood through his message and his rejection. So technically rejection or reject is a fill in the blank twice, but I didn't really catch that. All right, now, to go back to number one, the silence of God or divine hiddenness, all right. To finally answer that question, why did Jesus refuse to perform a miracle in Nazareth, and why does God seemingly hide himself in the world today? I offer this answer that I think answers both of those questions, all right? There's only one miracle of God that has occurred and does occur and will occur at all times and in every place in the world. What is that? Yes. Wait, who? Arlene, was that you?
Yeah.
100 points for you. Gold star on your chart, all right? That is true, right? Now, that doesn't mean that, every single person in the world gets saved, but the offer is there, right? And here's the thing, right? And I really don't want to get into this, so if you want to, argue the semantics of this, please don't, I don't really care, okay? But, technically, a miracle is something that only God can do, and everybody sort of knows it's only something God can do, all right? And I think, partially in our attempt to give credit to God for a lot of things, we sort of throw around the word miracle a lot. And I understand that, language is sort of fluid, so, the way we use words changes over time. But I still don't like it, all right? The first 9 times I tried to crank my car, it wouldn't start, but the 10th time it did. It's a miracle from God. Maybe it was God, or maybe your battery just charged itself. I don't know. There's a difference between stuff like that and what you read in the Bible that's called a miracle, where it's this guy that's been crippled his entire life all of a sudden can walk. That's pretty clearly, there's not any other explanation for that other than God, all right? And salvation totally fits that category, right? The only way that you can be reconciled to God the Father has to be from the Son of God the Father, Jesus Christ, right? That can only be something from God, all right? So, you're blank, right? The miracle of God that does occur everywhere, or has the ability to be performed everywhere, and it has happened throughout all of history without breaks, is salvation or reconciliation or any sort of word like that, all right? God is always at work bringing people into a right relationship with himself, all right? So Jesus doesn't play the crowd's games. He doesn't perform a healing miracle, all right? Because he knew that they ultimately rejected his message of the condemnation of sin, of salvation, all right? Jesus did, however, preach that the year of the Lord's favor has been fulfilled in your hearing. So in other words, Jesus might not have performed a magic trick to the crowd, but he did preach the forgiveness of sins, all right? Freedom from the oppressed, the year of the Lord's favor, all that is sort of salvific language. So he preaches that. That's what he sort of offers up as his proof. He doesn't offer up as proof, hocus pocus, bam, here's your miracle, I'm the Son of God. Jesus doesn't do that, all right? It's very similar to today, all right? And again, this sort of goes back to people today that ask, well, why doesn't God reveal himself today like he did in the Bible? Very similar to today. Jesus doesn't show up on Sunday morning and perform a magic trick in church. If he did, that would be cool. And I think, I could just retire right now because my life would be complete. Probably not going to happen though, all right? But I hope anyway that every Sunday the gospel goes out and the opportunity for salvation is always there, all right? And that is a miracle from God, all right? Here's the thing. The next chapter, Jesus talks about, hey, the paralyzed man, which in Luke is in chapter 5, and I just preached on this a couple weeks ago, all right? What does Jesus say? Your sins are forgiven, all right? So think, a miracle is something only God can do, and everybody knows it's only something God can do. Jesus' one miracle that he does isn't what the crowd wants him to do. His miracle is the year of the Lord's favor, salvation, forgiveness of sins. In chapter 5, Jesus talks about the forgiveness of sins, and he's accused of blasphemy. Why? Because the Jewish leaders understand that forgiving sins is only something God can do. In other words, the forgiveness of sins is a miracle. And the Jewish leaders thought, you're not God, so you can't perform a miracle, so you are blaspheming by saying you can, all right? It all kind of comes full circle. It all kind of ties it together, all right? All right, now, very last section. We have 15 minutes, so we're doing great. All right. Jesus' first miracles as recorded in Luke, all right? If you have like a chronological Bible or something, it's going to have other stuff before this. This is according to Luke, the first miracle as recorded in Luke. All right, chapter 4, verse 31. Then he went down to Capernaum, a town in Galilee, and on the Sabbath he taught the people. They were amazed at his teaching because his words had authority. In the synagogue there was a man possessed by a demon, an impure spirit. And he cried out at the top of his voice, "Go away! What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth?" What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Be quiet, Jesus said sternly. Come out of him. Then the demon threw the man down before them all and came out without injuring him. All the people were amazed and said to each other, "What words these are! With authority and power he gives orders to impure spirits and they come out." The news about him spread throughout the surrounding area. Jesus left the synagogue and went to the home of Simon. Now Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked Jesus to help her. So he bent over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. She got up at once and began to wait on them. At sunset, the people brought to Jesus all who had various kinds of sicknesses, and laying his hands on each one, he healed them. Excuse me. Moreover, demons came out of many people, shouting, "You are the Son of God." But he rebuked them and would not allow them to speak, because they knew he was the Messiah. At daybreak, Jesus went out to a solitary place, and the people were looking for him. When they came to where he was, they tried to keep him from leaving them. But he said, "I must proclaim the good news of the kingdom of God to the other towns also, because this is why I was sent." And he kept on preaching in the synagogues of Judea. All right, now, there's a lot there, and we're not going to talk about all of it, all right? Because that's kind of the nature of trying to cover a chapter a week. You just can't talk about it all. But the Messianic secret, all right? If you Google the Messianic secret, it's going to bring up something a little bit different than what I'm talking about, all right? So I'm not like endorsing the book, The Messianic Secret, all right? It's kind of a fitting title for what I'm talking about, all right? The first miracle that's given attention by Luke is Jesus exorcising this demon in Capernaum, all right? And it's kind of important in the way that Luke orders his narrative, because it says, after this, the news of Jesus began to spread. So you have the birth of Jesus, the baptism of Jesus, proving himself, the true Son of God, overcoming temptation. And now you have Jesus's first, big public recorded miracle in Luke anyway. And after that, bam, word begins to get out and spread. So you can see how he's kind of ordering these things, all right? So Jesus' fame is beginning to rise and the news is beginning to spread. However, there's one aspect of all of this that Jesus doesn't necessarily want to spread. He doesn't necessarily want to get out, all right? Jesus attempts to prevent the fact that he is the Messiah, the Son of God, from spreading, all right? And this isn't actually unique to this one passage. You see elsewhere, Jesus, when he heals people, he says the same thing. In chapter 5, we'll talk about, hopefully, well, not next week, but 2 weeks from now, I guess. In chapter 5 of Luke, Jesus heals a man with leprosy, and he orders him, he says, don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifice that Moses commanded you for your cleansing, all right? Of course, the guy didn't listen, he went and told everyone anyway, but, still. This idea is sort of what connects these early miracles of Jesus, right? I'm going to cast out this demon, but I'm going to shut the demon up so it doesn't tell anyone. I'm going to heal this guy with leprosy, but I'm going to try to shut the guy up so it doesn't tell anyone. But, it doesn't necessarily work out that way, all right? Here in chapter 4, in verses 34 and 35, right, the demon proclaims, I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And what does Jesus say? He says, be quiet, right? He doesn't want the demon saying that. Similarly, in verse 41 of chapter 4 that we read, Jesus rebuked the demons and would not allow them to speak because it says they knew he was the Messiah. All right? And also we have the leper, like I talked about. So this idea of Jesus being sort of secretive, all right, it kind of goes hand in hand with what we just talked about of the aspect of the silence of God or divine hiddenness, all right? Here's your first blank. Why would Jesus command such a thing? All right. Why would Jesus say be quiet? Why would Jesus not want this, the fact that he is the Messiah getting out? All right. Wouldn't he want more people to hear, more people to believe, and more people to accept him as the Messiah? Doesn't he condemn people who reject him as the Messiah? Well, yes. All right. So let's talk about it. All right. You kind of miss this in Luke's gospel. I'm pretty sure anyway. I don't think there's a parallel of this. In Matthew chapter 12, verses 14 through 17. And I'm just going to go ahead and read that, even though it is like 3 verses. So the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Being aware of this, Jesus withdrew from that place, and a large crowd followed him, and he healed all who were ill. He warned them not to tell others about him. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. All right, and then it quotes the prophet Isaiah. So in other words, the Pharisees, they want to kill Jesus. Jesus knows this, and he goes away. The crowd follows him. He heals a bunch of people, and he tells the crowd of the people that he healed, don't tell anyone about him, right? Basically, hey, keep this on the down low. And Matthew gives us a twofold insight into why Jesus commanded this silence. Number one, because the Pharisees were trying to kill him, all right? Obviously, we know God's in control. No one can touch Jesus until the appointed time. But still, in the same way that like throwing yourself off of a cliff would be to put God to the test, to just walk around saying, the guy you're looking for that says he's the Messiah, yeah, that's me. Yeah, I mean, that would be kind of putting God to the test. That would be kind of foolishness on Jesus' part, all right? Even though God is ultimately in control, all right? That would actually probably be sinful for Jesus to do that. That's the first purpose that Matthew gives us. The second purpose that Matthew points out is that it serves a very theological purpose because Jesus fulfills Old Testament prophecy, all right? This is actually the quote from Isaiah that Matthew gives. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets, skip a little bit down, till he has brought justice through to victory. All right? So no one will hear his voice. He will not quarrel. He will not cry out. In one aspect, that is kind of talking about the cross. But in another aspect, especially when you think about the context of what's happening directly in Matthew as this is quoted, it's talking about Jesus wanting to keep the fact that he's the Son of God on the down low, right? Because it says, Jesus sent these people away, said, don't tell anyone. Why? To fulfill what Isaiah said. He will not cry out, his voice will not be heard until he has brought justice through victory. In other words, until the cross, right? So at the appointed time, when he has brought justice through to victory, his voice will be heard. This is your blank. At the appointed time, all right? At the appointed time, when the Pharisees will actually be successful in killing Jesus. Technically it was the Romans, but it was the Pharisees that wanted it, so it's kind of both. Basically, at the appointed time of the crucifixion, and after Jesus rises again. The message of his messiahship, if that's even a word, will go out in full force. All right? So it's not like Jesus kept that on the down low for all of eternity, right? But, this is your next film blank. Ultimately, until that time, it was hidden from the masses. All right? This is a quote that I think really pulls all this together, all right? It says, a right knowledge of Jesus as the Christ and as Redeemer is only had in connection with the cross. In other words, if your idea of who Jesus is doesn't include the Son of God who died on the cross, you don't really know Jesus, all right? Still part of this quote. He only has a right, a person only has a right to name Jesus publicly as the Christ if he will give to him, if he will participate. I'm trying to word this. It's one of those old commentaries that uses the fancy words. I'm trying to word this in a better way. Basically, you can only claim to follow Christ if you follow him in his suffering, is basically what this quote says, all right? And follow in the way of the cross, all right? That's the quote. So this sort of ties everything we talked about together, all right? You have Jesus making a case for sonship through suffering, all right? I'm going to take the harder route to obtain not just more authority, but to fulfill my mission of, right, let me go back. As it says, proclaim good news, healing, liberty, sight, and the acceptable year of the Lord, all right? I'm going to take the harder route than just give in and worship Satan, all right? So you have that aspect. You also have prophethood, right, through rejection. In other words, not only does he make a better case for being the Son of God through suffering, he makes a better case for being a true prophet through rejection. And you also have the silence of this up until the appointed time of the crucifixion. And it all sort of wrapped up in that quote. You can only, right, claim to know Jesus as Christ and Redeemer in connection with the cross. And you can only claim Jesus publicly as the Christ if you will follow him in his sufferings and in the way of the cross, all right? So we don't really have an application, but that's your application, all right? Jesus said, hey, I'm the Son of God, and my proof isn't that I can turn a stone into bread. My proof isn't that I can throw myself off a cliff and an angel will catch me. My proof is that I'm obedient to God. It's the same way with you and me, all right? If we claim to be a son or daughter of God, the proof isn't that we can, run laps around the sanctuary and speak in tongues. And I'm not trying to make fun of churches that do that. But, that's not what the proof of being a follower of God is. The proof is our obedience, even suffering like Christ, right? I mean, look at the apostles, right? If we're really speaking the truth, and I don't want to say that we speak truth on the same level as Jesus, obviously, but anytime that you speak truth, inherently someone is going to reject that and reject you because of that, just like they did with Jesus. And the last one, right, I mean, the, silence, the sort of keeping that on the down low until the appointed time, right? And this also sort of answers the question of, right, our idea of a gospel presentation. Why did Jesus never preach that? Well, because the gospel hadn't really been fulfilled yet, right? You can only really understand Jesus if you understand the cross, and the cross hadn't happened yet. So there's also sort of the theological aspect of keep that on the down low, because it's all going to come together in a few years when I die and when I come back to life. And then it makes sense that it goes out in mass, because then people have the full picture, right? If you start telling people, well, look at what Jesus did. Jesus literally tells his disciples, I'm going to die. Did they understand that? No, they actually rejected that. They're like, don't talk about dying, Jesus, you're not going to die, right? And Jesus has to kind of rebuke them for that, right? So anyway, all right. Look at the time. Any questions or anything? All right. We're also wore out from that, sprint through chapter 4. We don't have to, please stop, you're hurting my brain. Okay. All right, well, like I said, no lesson next week.